1966 and 68, their TV series ran for 58 episodes, and in 1967 alone, they had 4 #1 albums, a feat that has never been replicated since. These are some of the stories, locations, and people that played a part in their meteoric rise and subsequent fall, and then their rise again. The Prefab Four, the Monkees. So at just 30 and 31 years old, Hollywood pioneers and new Hollywood producers, Bob Rafelson and Bert Schneider, had been throwing around an idea about a struggling rock band for years. But it wasn't until the Beatles came out with A Hard Day's Night that they were able to turn a few heads in Hollywood and possibly get the thing produced, which brings us to our first stop here. It all culminated with a couple crazy days of auditioning right here at their offices on Gower. They had run an ad in Variety that said, looking for 4 insane boys between 17 and 21, Ben Frank types who have the courage to work. Ben Frank's was a coffee shop that stayed open all night down on Sunset that the rock crowd used to hang out at. So more than 400 potential Monkees lined up here to audition, including Danny Hutton from Three Dog Night, and legendary LA DJ Rodney Bingenheimer, who later got a gig as a stand-in for Davy Jones. They were about the same height. Stephen Stills took a screen test also, but he was here mainly to sell his songs. And he passed on the gig when he found out that wasn't what it was about. But he did tell them he had a friend that would be perfect for it. And of course, he was talking about Peter Tork. When offered a cigarette at the audition, Peter replied, "I don't smoke those." And in an instant, an unspoken connection with pot-smoking producers Schneider and Rafelson was formed. And of course, he got the gig. Right here. So the lineup was set, and in November of 1965, they started filming the pilot here in LA and on location in San Diego. And also here at what is now the Sunset Gower Studios. This used to be Screen Gems. And by the way, the address given for the Monkees' 2-story beach pad in the series was 1334 Beechwood Drive, which is right here. After the pilot was filmed, Rafelson tested it for the studios, but they hated it. And it wasn't until he went back and re-edited, actually used some of the black and white Monkees auditions that they had done, interspersed with it, that he came up with something that would satisfy the studio, but also satisfy the 60s generational kids that were looking for something different. Right here. So NBC eventually picked up the series and made a commitment for 32 episodes, for which each Monkee would be paid $480 per week. The filming began, but there was still one major sticking point. The band had thus far produced 0 music, and as a matter of fact, that part of the formula was in utter chaos. Time was running out, and the producers enlisted the services of a 32-year-old New York music impresario, Don Kirshner, or the man with the golden ears as he was known. At the time, he was an uber-successful music publisher, and it was said the only instrument Kirshner played was the telephone. But he could smell the money to be made on the Monkees all the way from New York City. Anyways, he flew her to LA and set up shop at the most expensive digs in town, the Beverly Hills Hotel, and worked out of his room there. Now, upon attending a Monkees rehearsal, he offered his no-holds-barred musical suggestions for the group. And then Micky Dolenz offered his no-holds-barred reply in the form of pouring a glass of Coke over Kirshner's head. But the ever-business-minded Kirshner didn't let it affect the meeting in the least. He simply went on with his suggestions. But that wasn't to say he forgave and forgot. Far from it. The initial recordings for the Monkees were done right near the intersection of Hollywood and Vine in Hollywood. At El Dorado Recorders, and it's now defunct, but it had this gigantically long staircase up to it. And it's where they did their very first recordings, including the iconic theme, the Monkees theme. And subsequent to that, they moved down the street to RCA Studio B, which is on Sunset. And pretty much anybody who's anybody at the time recorded there. Elvis did a lot of recording there. Waylon Jennings, the Grateful Dead, and the Rolling Stones actually recorded Satisfaction in that studio. But back then they didn't have the luxury of all the tracks we have today with Pro Tools and such. And just to kind of give you an example of how they did it, it's like this. You know, in the 70s, 80s, we had 24 tracks, right? And then basically before that, it was 8 tracks in the mid-70s, early 70s. And back when they were doing things, it was 4 tracks. So they had to do everything on these 4 right here, which meant, you know, basically you'd have 2 tracks for instruments, drums, bass, guitar, all that kind of good stuff. 1 for lead vocal, and then the 4th track was left to bounce. So you'd bounce these tracks so you could keep on getting another track. It somewhat degraded the quality of the recording, unfortunately, but that's how they still sound great. But the key to it was you couldn't do too many takes. You didn't have the luxury in those days of punching in, so you had to get things quickly. And most producers turned to the services of seasoned session musicians. And in LA, you had one of the best. They were called the Wrecking Crew. And, you know, Micky Dolenz and Davy Jones, this was just fine with them. But Peter Tork and Mike Nesmith were experienced musicians, and they wanted to play on their own record. And they started mutinying in the studio virtually from the first day. Now, the Monkees had a lot of help in the form of some really great young songwriters. Neil Diamond, for instance, wrote I'm a Believer and A Little Bit Me, A Little Bit You. But I think the real unsung heroes of the whole Monkees recording experience was Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart. Early on, they actually put a band together called the Candy Store Prophets and would play live gigs to find out what kind of overall sound would work best with the Monkees. And I have to say, I think the results speak for themselves. They wrote Last Train to Clarksville. They wrote Stepping Stone, which is one of my personal favorites and has been covered many times. And they went round and round with several different producers before Don Kirshner stepped in, and he gave the reins to Boyce and Hart to actually produce the Monkees, and it's what worked for the first album. But nevertheless, no matter how pragmatic Boyce and Hart were with the band, ultimately it came down to Don Kirshner, and Don Kirshner ruled with an iron fist. He picked the songs, he picked the arrangements, he chose the final mixes. And to say the Monkees resented him would be a bit like saying Pete Best resented the Beatles for kicking him out. So now we're on Holloway in West Hollywood, and this street is somewhat famous for Sal Mineo was murdered here in front of his apartment right here back in 1976. But it also has a legacy for being where Davy Jones's first apartment in Los Angeles was, right here. So let's check it out. So Davy was born in Manchester, England, and he was a child actor. And when he was 15, he was cast as the Artful Dodger in the musical Oliver in London. And it eventually moved to Broadway. And on February 9th, 1964, the Oliver cast did a short performance at the Ed Sullivan Show. Of course, that was the night that the Fab Four made their initial United States performance, kind of changed the face of rock and roll that night. And just like the rest of us, Davy Jones was smitten. He watched the show from the wings, and he knew he wanted a piece of that. Davy eventually left Broadway, but he stayed here in the States. He came out here to LA and signed a contract with Screen Gems and was doing, you know, TV spots like things like Ben Casey. But the fact that he was signed with Screen Gems meant he was contractually obligated to audition for the Monkees. But I think it worked out pretty good for him. Now we're on the Sunset Strip, just around the corner from Davy's apartment and about a 5-minute drive from Laurel Canyon. And this was formerly Ben Frank's coffee shop, mentioned in the Monkees audition ad. And at the time, every rocker and wannabe on the Strip hung out here after the nightclubs closed. The Byrds, the Seeds, Buffalo Springfield, and the eventual members of the Monkees. So after the first Monkees payday and a signing advance of $15,000, Michael, his wife Phyllis, and their young son moved here just above the Sunset Strip and were joined for several weeks by the temporarily homeless Davy and Micky. So I think Mike Nesmith was probably the most provocative choice to be a Monkee. He was married, he was from the South, he had a young child, and he had big ambitions to be a songwriter. Ultimately, he did get a couple songs recorded for the Monkees, but probably his biggest song was a different drum for Linda Ronstadt and the Stone Ponies. It was her first hit. And Michael first heard the song in Philadelphia in the back of a limo with the other Monkees, and they didn't believe he had written it. And it's my opinion that more than anybody else in the group, Mike Nesmith really resented the whole Fab Four thing. And he spent a lot of his time in the Monkees trying to take back the power from the studios. And in the case of Don Kirshner, he was successful. By the Monkees' third album, which was called Headquarters, it was mostly played and written by the Monkees themselves. About a 20-minute drive from the Screen Gem set in Hollywood, and we're in beautiful downtown Burbank at Warner Brothers Studios. The backlot here used to be known as Columbia Ranch, and many of the outdoor scenes for the Monkees TV series were shot right here. One of the most significant aspects of the show was the Monkees were, for better or worse, largely responsible for the advent of the music video, which was usually the climax of all 58 episodes of the show. And in a biblically ironic twist, it would be the music video and MTV that would resurrect their careers 20 years up the road. We're in the very heart of Laurel Canyon, and this used to be the home of Micky Dolenz. And along with Davy Jones, he was one of the two primary lead singers in the band. He was a really superb singer, and in my opinion, he was somewhat underrated. But he was cast as the zany, wisecracking character in the TV show, which wasn't really too far from the truth of the matter. When it was first suggested that the band learn to play their own instruments and go on tour, Micky suggested that it was rather like Leonard Nimoy wanting to become a real Vulcan. The lightning-like fame that came with being a Monkee kind of thrust Micky into a smaller circle of friends. And it wasn't uncommon for Keith Moon, Harry Nilsson, John Lennon, Alice Cooper to be seen partying here at the house with him. Oh, to be a fly on the wall, right? So by 1968, and 2 years into the experiment, the Monkees had attained dizzying heights they never thought attainable, and really the only mountain left to climb was feature films. So they had moved their production offices here to a place on La Brea and had settled on a very conceptual script written by Bob Rafelson and a then unknown actor named Jack Nicholson. And it was a very conceptual movie that was born out of an idea that they got when they were up in Ojai a couple weeks earlier, spitballing with the band, Rafelson, Nicholson, and a 2-pound bag of Hawaiian weed. And thus became Head. So now we're on Hollywood Boulevard, and this is Vogue Theater. And in November of 1968, this is where the premiere of Head took place. And, I know it's not exactly the Chinese theater. The movie ends with the Monkees jumping off a bridge. And I think this was a great metaphor for the movie itself because commercially it was like jumping off a bridge. It didn't do well at all. I don't think the world was ready to see the Prefab Four in anything other than their bubblegum image. But the movie was soon overshadowed by Rafelson and Schneider's next release, which was Easy Rider. But Head's lasting legacy didn't occur for another 20 years when it developed a cult following, and it has become a staple at midnight movie houses all around the world. So up this long driveway here is where Peter Tork lived in 1968. And there's actually a really great place to see it up above on the hiking trail. So come on, Jeff, let's take a look. It had been scarcely 3 years since the Monkees' original auditions, and the ridiculous excess of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll life had taken its toll on the group, and no more so than on Peter Tork. He was way more of a hippie than his bandmates. So in 1968, this was the Peter Tork Shady Oaks house right here. And it wasn't uncommon for 30 people to be sleeping there and using the pool. And if you were at Tork's house, it was totally clothing optional. It was commonplace for jam sessions to occur here. Jimi Hendrix, Buddy Miles, Pete Townsend. And the neighbors used to complain very often about a band rehearsing there. And it was actually Peter's housemate, Stephen Stills, rehearsing Crosby, Stills, Nash, and then later Young. So Peter officially quit the Monkees on December 30th, 1968, which incidentally happens to be the birthdays of Mike Nesmith and Davy Jones. But he was forced to pay a $160,000 breach of contract fine to get out of the contract. And he said it made him both terribly sad and terribly glad at the same time. But there were still tons of people living at the house, and Peter was supporting all of it, and his accountant was absolutely freaking out. There was no way he could sustain it without the Monkees' touring income. And he also found himself slipping more into drugs and alcoholism. And within 2 years' time, he found himself in Northern California waiting tables and busking on street corners. So about a year after Peter left the group, Mike Nesmith paid his $160,000 breach of contract fine. And he left too, and for all intents and purposes, that ended the 60s version of the Monkees. You know, in many ways, the Monkees became the scapegoats for all the prepackaged music that had come before them. And I think it overshadows some of the real contributions to music. One being taking control out of the hands of unscrupulous studio corporations. And the other, and I think biggest contribution, was that they were by large part responsible for the invention of the music video. And that's something that has changed television for over 50 years to this day. So I'm not sure if it's going to show a record or a TV screen on there. Oh, here it is right here. Okay, it's the TV screen. Ultimately, it took 15 years for the backlash to end, and in 1986, MTV aired all of the original episodes, and it totally relaunched their careers. And they spent the rest of their time touring in different forms, really until 2021, when Michael Nesmith died, and it left Micky Dolenz as the very last Monkee. I don't think that we remembered so much as the Prefab Four, as the Pretty Fabulous Four. So for Davy Jones, Mike Nesmith, Micky Dolenz, and Peter Tork, I'd like to say thank you. And if you haven't done it already, I would shamelessly ask you to subscribe to the channel. I've got some great videos on tap, and I think some really good ones in our library if you want to check them out. So for Tim, keep playing it and keep playing it loud. Peace out to you. Bye-bye.